Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, checking in on my newest systems. They have these European night crawlers living in them. They're only 20 days in service. And they were launched with no food, and we came back on day 10 to give them their first meal of watermelon and coffee. That was 10 days ago, so now we're coming back to give them their next feeding. And we got an interesting situation going on in those bins with the wool fabric composting experiment. And I think the age is now 238 days. I should have written it down. It was just in front of me up in the computer, a spreadsheet that keeps track. But the wool sweater is contained in plastic boxes. You get the gist of it once we get in there to feed them. We're also going to be extracting the bait box from the material that those worms that live over there left behind in their old systems. The labels from their old systems are over here, and the bait box was deployed during the last check-in. I did come in here one time over the past 10 days and dampen it just to try to make it that much more interesting for the worms to want to come up. At the same time, I stirred around any of the material out on the top surface that was dry, sending that down into the material, basically, drying the overall moisture content of all the stuff in there, further hopefully motivating the worms to exit. So let's get the bait box collected out of the castings, and then we can mark that off as an official harvestable batch of vermicompost. Then we can proceed to getting the young worm bins out on the bench and fed. So let's get to work. Retrieving the bait box was nothing more than lifting it up out of the box of castings. But I did take the time, as you could tell from the appearance of my glove, that I did go plowing around underneath where this thing was resting through the castings to see if I could find any worms, and I did find one, and I threw them in here with whatever other worms gathered in here. And I guess it'll be a surprise to see what we achieved as far as rounding up stragglers, but my check-in on the thing during the week when I agitated and aerated the castings and I moistened them, I didn't really disrupt what was happening in the bait box, so I didn't really get a sneak peek at how things were progressing. I have no idea how many worms we are going to find. And no, these are not more bait boxes. These are the boxes where we're containing our wool fabric. So my expectation for the wool fabric experiment was for it to be done long ago, like 100 days ago, long before these worms would kind of outlive their environment and need to be moved on. So I had to figure out a way to get the wool fabric over here, and it seemed to me like throwing it in a box like this would be an easy way to keep it all in one place and don't let it all blend in with the surrounding materials and lose track of it all. I definitely like the way it looks with worms throughout this stuff, occupying it. Very nice. Very nice. And wow. You could tell right away when you start running your fingers through I guess just a mound of what's only worms, basically. I'm a little bit surprised, to tell you the truth, that there's so many worms hanging up here in the wool. Because I was thinking for sure that the trench that we dug underneath the box with the watermelon in it was going to become the spot where all the worms want to gather. But it's great to see that there's worms here already. And unlike last time when we came here with frozen watermelon for them, we knew that we couldn't just put the watermelon in with the, okay, what happened with our, oh, here we go, our feeding zone indicator. Let's just keep it from being buried over here. So, what was I saying? Lost my train of thought, but I think it had something to do with trying to present the worms with a big pile of frozen food by pretty much dropping it right on top of them, which wouldn't have been a very nice thing. So we opted to put the frozen food down below the box in the bedding below. And after that thawed out, I'm sure it became a real popular spot for the worms to gather in. But right now I'm allowing myself to get pretty distracted here by what's going on in the wool experiment container. Here I was more geeking at the worms rather than examining the status of the here we go, the wool sweater. It's just so interesting when a piece of fabric, some sort of a garment, clothing, starts to go to pieces like this. This is clearly at least part of it where the neck was, where the care instructions and the label are on it, but there's only little clumps of wool still adhering to it. So my guess is that all the rest of the wool that's no longer hanging to something like this is in little clumps like this throughout the plastic box. So I'm glad it's here, you know, contained. I'm not sure it'll be easy to track how far it's coming along if it's really in tiny fragments like that all over the place, but we'll just have to see. So to make their meal today, something that I could just simply throw right in here on top of the wool, I took a bunch of stuff out of my freezer and then I proceeded to spread it out as best as I could over here and microwave it to so that it's not frozen, and I think it's ready to go. So it's mainly carrot peel. There's some cabbage, and there's some other peels of other things here too, and fragments of other things here too. Stuff used to make a soup. And let's just set this aside briefly and figure out how they did with the last feeding before we jump to feeding them today. How does that sound? Alright, I had too much fun over there checking that out. I really didn't expect, you know, so many worms around the wool. And that's because right down here, we dug a trench and we placed all their delicious watermelon into this trench. And I figured that this would be the spot that the worms would all gravitate towards. But what I placed up on the wool sweater, that coffee, a day's worth of coffee, was probably enough to keep them satisfied with, you know, with respect to having a food supply. And when they're in that plastic box, my expectation is that they're using the wool as their bedding, but also taking a nibble out of it here and there. So my intention was not to feed down here, just to see how they did with the watermelon. And I guess a whole bunch of moisture was what I sort of expected to find. I sort of thought we'd see more worms, to tell you the truth. So, whatever, this piece of paper could just stay where it was. Yeah, you know, today's feeding is going to go right into the box. And my bedding for today's feeding might seem a little bit cheesy, but it's paper towels and napkins. Figure a nice freshly built bin like this that's fairly young, loaded with nice lovely bedding everywhere and everywhere. It probably wouldn't hurt to just give them some perhaps less interesting bedding to accompany their feeding. And today it's going to be stuff from the waste paper collection. Napkins and paper towels. So, well, it feels like we've been just dodging giving these guys their food. I feel like I'm teasing them now, so I think it's time to proceed to giving them their carrots. I just thought I'd take a little peek here and there beyond where the melon was fed, just from a general perspective of how adoption of the environment is coming along. And even by the only day 10 last time we were in here, they were already in all reaches of in the systems. They were all over the place, occupying different portions. And you know, this is where we're gonna cut over to releasing the worms from the bait box. And this is where I'm going to be turning to you guys as the viewers to help me by leaving a comment once you get a chance to see how this turnout was here in the bait box. Let me know how many worms you think we just released into here, because I keep track, and this will be like, I think, my first announcement of what's the estimated worm count. I think only a half a dozen people responded, or that might be half a dozen people including my estimate mixed in there too, but it's 2,038 No, 2,038 in bin 2, but 2,238. Interesting how both numbers have 38 at the end. But now we're going to skew the worm count estimate for bin number 2, because this is the system thought to have the fewer number of worms living in it. And this is where we're going to release the worms that gathered into the bait box. So it's a little bit tricky to see them because they're surrounded by, you know, shreds of paper and cardboard. But if I slow down a bit and give them a chance to wriggle for us, we'll get a chance to see how many gathered. I'm glad I came in here during kind of midway between the last check-in and now to give this thing a dampening, because even now it's starting to feel like it could use more. But luckily the material down at the bottom was pretty moist, so I'm glad I came in here and sprayed it down one time. But that's going to be it for our inspection of the worms. Please leave a comment. How many extra worms are being added to system number 2 over here? And you know, I think only because when worms are in here I want them focusing on the wool, I think I'm going to add them down low underneath the box where all that newly added bedding can go. And then the bedding that I was going to include with the feeding, the napkins and paper towels, I was thinking of creating little, let's see here, kind of like little burrito wraps of all that shredded, lovely shredded carrot and parsnip. I think there's some of that white carrot in here and something else. But let's start by splitting up this one leaf that we have, because I've only got one. And that one won't go into a burrito, but here we'll start with a piece of paper towel and a nice generous handful of material with which to stuff it. It looks pretty good. Alright, and then I guess we'll just somehow start piling it in. It seems like we've got enough material here to wrap a second burrito, and I just happen to have 2 more napkins here. These are a little bit larger, I would say, than the paper towel. But wow, there's a lot of juice collected here too. I sort of expected some of the juice to come out of this stuff as it starts to thaw, and there it is. So I'm glad I'm catching it in our little burrito wrap. That's a nice feeding if you ask me. And you know, we're not even done, because I've got some other stuff over here on the side that I'd like to give them as well. I don't have coffee, and coffee is usually the trigger for me to go reaching for my worm chow, but even though there's no coffee today, I do have my worm chow. And the other thing I like to include with worm bin feedings is grit. So let's start in with the grit. That in itself is something that the worms definitely enjoy ingesting as well, so I'm sure they'll be glad to see that. And then my worm chow. I don't know, just sort of winging it here, giving them a nice hefty portion. Seems to me like a nice meal, if you ask me. And let's see, I think that's about it. We had feeding zone indicators though, didn't we? So we got to mark where we fed. It's only tradition. Well, at least if we've got a feeding zone indicator. In this case, we've got one that's now decided to become 2, and that works pretty good over there. The one that we had here, I think, might still be holding together a little bit better and might be a single object. Yes, it is. And it's going to go on in that style right there. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in with the 20-day-old European Nightcrawler worm bins. Working on the wool. And now getting the feeding applied in such a way that it redirects their energy and their attention to the wool, which is where the feeding they just received was placed. And now we've got some extra worms in there. Don't forget, those little guys that we just added from the bait box, from their finished castings. I've already got a number brewing in my head for what I think I saw there, and I'd love to hear what you think. So please leave a message, leave a comment. Let me know how many worms you believe we just added to the population of bin number 2. I wonder if we're going to come close to matching. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. All right, everyone, that's it for the check-in. I hopefully enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.